Okay, in this lesson we're going to talk about smart vectors. Now vectors are commonly a multicolored tool to drive motion blur. It's usually a arbitrary output variable or kind of render pass that you render out of, say, V-Ray or Arnold. And that pass is used to drive motion blur in post using the previous and the forward frame to interpolate actual motion blur. What's really cool about it is it can be used to put like decals and cleanup work on fluttering clothes. So anything that moves around, say a fluttering flag or like this, it can also be used for, putting tattoos on a face and so forth. As you can see here, we got Blue's cheeks are moving up and down as he's drinking his coffee. That movement right there can be recorded. It's kind of working under the same workflow of contrast points tracked. It's like planar tracking, but it's in some sort of vector field. So it is for stuff that's a little bit more crazy as far as the movement. And in this case, we're going to demo that right here. In the same way I talked about before, there is some restrictions, especially this shot, in the way that it's good to have the thing in the frame for the entire duration. In this case, we don't have that. So it's going to be a bit tricky deciding which frame to actually choose for the actual smart vectors and so forth. So I'm going to use frame 100 once again here. And I'm only going to be cleaning up like this area here again. I'm not going to be able to get to this area down here simply because you're going to see as I kind of demo this, there's going to be some weird error issues with this. So to create vectors, by the way, I want to remind you, don't forget to do cache clear all. Again, you might play back and see some weird flickering, and again, just go to cache clear all and then play it back, and you won't have any weird issues in regards to seeing any strange artifacts. So we could just type in smart vectors, and it's going to ask for an input, and in this case I will put this through to the switch node here. And with the switch node set up, you can see it has vector details, and the larger you make this, the longer it's going to take to render, but it's actually better to have as many details as you possibly can. So I'll put the vector detail all the way up to 1, and the input is from 1 to 132. So it's going to write out a weird kind of psychedelic kind of like render that's going to be vector information. So the file itself, I got to choose where to render this. So I'm going to click here, and I'm going to go to my file where I have it. In this case, it's going to be in my class folder, and I made a folder here called Smart Vectors, and I'm going to call this Smart Vec, and then I will choose dot, 3 hashtags, and a dot, and I'm going to choose EXR. They have to be EXR format because it is a 32-bit float image with values of super whites and sub blacks, so we definitely need to have an OpenEXR. And again, I could just, if I want to keep this relatively simple, I can come back to my right node and grab my nice little file extension here. This is going to be, again, a favor for you folks. You don't have to do this, but again, I'm just going to put this to this, basically write it to that folder. And I'm going to hit render and get a good large cup of coffee. So just hit render. And you can see it's going to take some time to bake out all these passes here. This is going to be very large files, by the way, just FYI. These are EXR files, so they will be large. But I'm going to try to capture as much data as I can. Sometimes you can add a sharpening node here to kind of get some contrast on these little edges here. That's another possibility if you wish, but in this case, we're just going to kind of let this render through. Okay, so now these smart vectors are actually in here. If you put your viewer to the smart vector node here now, you'll see you have a smart vector input, and you get this crazy psychedelic type work going on here, which is an interesting pass. So there's a couple things you can do with this as a side note. Let me just show you what I mean by that is you can take this information to drive actual vectors for motion blur. So again, this is kind of a segue here, but I can come in here and do vector to motion, which will actually take the smart vector information, and I Nuke, and it turns it into motion data. So if you go to motion data, you now have this interesting info that actually records motion vector, motion information that could be dialed into basically motion blur. So if you find that your scene was shot with a shutter speed that was like, Saving Private Ryan, where there is no motion blur, and you're like, I want to add motion blur to it, sometimes people do that. They will shoot a scene with a high, very fast shutter so that there's no motion blur in their scene, so that they can get some solid tracking for really shaky shots that require very accurate tracking and less motion blur. And then they add motion blur in post. So what you can do is you can actually do a vector blur tool here. This is commonly used, again, for the AOV pass of vectors out of Maya or whatever package. I'm getting people emailing me now saying, do Blender, do Blender, do Blender. I'm like, Blender is awesome, and I really want to get into Blender, but I have to take some time to learn it. It's obviously a huge program, and I'm hearing such good news about it. In fact, it's not just people that are contacting me, but I'm hearing for so many people, like, go there, go there. So my first mountain to climb here is obviously jumping into the DaVinci Resolve Studio and even Fusion before I go and learn new programs such as that. So just give it some time, folks. So I'm back to RGBA. Here's my vector motion, and now what I can do is, first off, I'll need to copy in this information here. So I'm going to use a copy. Let's do a shuffle copy node, and I'm going to put this in as input 2 and put this in 1, and I'm basically going to copy the motion vectors to the motion vectors here. So put the motion to motion, and you can see I could just kind of repat this to the motion here. So if I put this shuffle copy to here, we now have that motion vector information copied into this downpipe. And now if I go to my vector blur, I'll put this to RGBA, and the vector blur, I say what UV channel information am I going to feed this to. I'm going to choose motion, and it says it is missing RGBA, so I think I might need to, let me just see if I don't think I have an alpha channel in here. I could be wrong. Yes, I don't. Okay. So I'm going to take this read node and turn on auto alpha. There we go. So this has to be set to auto alpha. Now I'll go ahead and put it through, and that should be good now. Okay, so again, whenever you read in these nodes, you want to make sure there's an auto alpha being created. Okay, so with that said, let's take a look here. Put this to vector blur now. Now you're not seeing much because there's no motion amount. You can see it's currently set to Nuke scanline. You can actually, it's really cool, there's defaults here for other programs. So if you did have motion data that was actually captured off of RenderMan or V-Ray or Arnold or Moto or Mental Ray, you can click on this and it'll automatically know the preset settings for it. In this case, we're using Nuke scanline render, which is basically what has been created here. So you can see the motion amount. If I find a frame here where his cup is going up into the air, let's find out where he puts his cup down from. It's already going to have motion blur, right? So kind of put that down like right there. And if I just take this and add motion blur, you can see I can basically exaggerate motion blur if I wish to. So imagine if this shot had 0 motion blur, right? And, I had the shutter speed, so, it captures frames really quick. And you're like, well, I did that so I can track the background accurately without any motion blur or something. Say it's a tumbling shot going down an alleyway really quick. You want to make sure that you can track every shot. In this case, you're allowed to augment or add to some motion blur data, which is really cool. You don't want to go too crazy with this because you can see what starts to happen here. We get some craziness here. What I find helps big time is blurring the UVs slightly. So you can see you can blur them with a uniform, which will clean up this little data right here. So if I put none, you get this harsh edge. And you can do linear as well. So uniform seems to be a good balance. And then the Gaussian motion blur is just fine. There's also a uniform. The motion blur amount, your shutter offset is basically centered. In other words, I think it is like 0.5 should be good. You have, and then there's a couple things else you can do in here. You want to make sure normalize is on, and then you can see soft lines is still not sure what that is. I have so many different things inside this program. So obviously we don't need to do any of this, so I'm going to delete all that, and we're just sticking with our smart vectors here. So I'm going to make a couple dot nodes here. So let's go ahead and hold down Control and drag out a dot node. And I'm going to drag out another dot node like that and bring this down here. And I'm going to do a frame hold at this point, at this juncture. And that frame hold is going to be at the frame 100. That's the frame I chose. So I'll do this and choose 100 and take a look through it. And you guessed it, we're going to do a Rotopaint node. And at this point, we also probably want to take this image and do a denoise on it. So I'll just grab my old classic denoise here and plug that through. And I'll put the denoise actually before the frame hold here. And I'll just grab my dot node there so you can see I've added the noise pattern. And we should be good to go. Again, with disable, re-enable, see if we got the noise. I think we did get the noise out. Could be mistaken. Let's make sure that, yeah, we got it, okay. And yes. All right, so frame hold. Let's go to our frame hold here. And now we're going to do some paint work. I'm not going to be able to get all the wrinkles down here. I'm probably only going to get them over here. But the same thing we did before, we just come in here, do the Rotopaint, just do some blurring. Set our hardness is set to 0.2. Put that to like 0.1. We could do opacity of 0.3. And just come in here and go for those large details here. So let me take this, put this down to probably 1.1. And I'm going to try to get rid of these. Yeah, try to get these big details out here. Anything that looks kind of like, you know, you got to watch out. You don't want to hit up the big edges, just the small stuff here. So there is a limitation, obviously, to what you can get away with in here. So I'm just trying to clean up bad wardrobe work. The wardrobe artist should be fired in this case. And let's see if I can just do a quick kind of paint around. We'll see how far we can get with this. Let's see if I can just do a general. See, if you do it too much, like I said, you're going to get some weird results here. So I'm just going to do a slight cleanup. There's really nothing I can do. Some of this is just, it is what it is, right? But I can try to get like these areas right here. By maintaining a couple of wrinkles, because you're going to just, got news for you, you're just going to have to keep them. There's nothing you can do. It's part of the texture of what is his jacket. But if we can try to do a little bit of cleanup work, it's better than no cleanup work at all. Going back to the turkey neck of Harrison Ford, I went back and watched the footage that my colleague did, and I kind of went, you know, he did get a lot of a decent turkey neck out of Harrison Ford's neck, but there's still some in there I noticed in certain shots. You know, dealing with the you know, crow's feet, usually in the eyes where you got like wrinkles. So. Alright, so again, I got to make sure all these paint strokes are set to all, so I'll just grab all of them again, go to lifetime, and say all frames. Now I have to create a roto for this. And, oops, just pull this over here. I'm going to start extending this over here a little bit. And we got to do another planar tracker. And the planar tracker is just to actually create the mask. So again, I'm going to go to frame 100. That's where I'm going to do my reference frame. And let's go ahead and track. So I'm only going to shoot for this area right here. And I'm going to keep this relatively on the inside. because I'm going to blur this in the same fashion that I did last time. So we'll be using a key mix again for this. So I'm just going to kind of do that and right click, make this a planar track, and then we just track forward. Now remember, all I'm doing is basically animating a mask. This is going to be a mask that I'm going to basically be used to basically use it as a masking tool. This is not the, I'm not doing what I did previous, obviously, for this area, but I'm just building a mask that I can blur and use that as the mask for the key mix itself. So again, just let it go straight through here. And very similar to what we did before, we're going to add a blur and blur the edges on this. So I'm going to go ahead and hit pause here. Alright, so same thing again. We're going to just track backwards with this. And again, just scrub to your reference frame. So let's go to this frame here. And again, track backwards. And again, I'm going to hit pause. Okay, so we are pretty much good to go. We got a nice roto here on the character. By the way, if you find that you're getting like Rotopaint nodes, the other thing that kept popping up, just take anything before your actual milestone, clean plate milestone, and hit D to disable, and disable everything. That way you get a faster feedback on here. When you're ready to re-enable, you can just re-enable. By the way, you can take things and enable them based on backdrop. So for instance, if I take this and hit D while holding this backdrop, it disables all nodes in this group, and then I can come over here and take this and hit D to disable that. I don't have to grab every node, I can just take the backdrop and turn it off. So I'm going to turn those two off, and I'm going to get a little bit of faster feedback, and then again, cache clear all once in a while to get rid of some weird glitches in the playback. I actually have this thing sitting over here, which is kind of strange, but you can see I got a pretty decent piece there that I'm going to use for Roto. But just by looking at it, you could see that it's not outputting alpha here. So again, the same issue we were having before, output alpha, pre-mult RGB. You hit replace, and we have an alpha here. Now I can actually blur this. So I'll add a blur to this. And again, I'm just blurring, make sure I'm blurring all. So I'm going to blur this up just a little bit so I get like an extended matte. And we are going to take that and use that as the mask for this. Okay, so with that said, we have all this data here. We have our paint work. Let's go ahead and go back to that. And again, we did that on frame 100. So what I do is I'll use a vector distort node. It's asking for two inputs, a source and a smart vector. So I'm going to put the vector information over here, the smart vector information here, and you have to set a frame for the reference frame. You're going to set this to 100. The actual frame distance, okay, should be probably nothing less than 100 frames, but if you read what it says in here, basically you should jack this all the way up to 6. The longer the sequence is laid out for this shot, the longer the sequence that you're going to have this going for, the more you have to put it. You can see it's working in powers of 2. As you can see here, so 1, 2, 4, 6, 8, 16, 32, 64 frames. So you can only go as high as 6. There's also a blur size which sort of helps blur the averages of this information. So I'm going to put my viewer to the vector distort here. And actually, at this point, let's make our key mix so we can get this thing basically taken care of. And then we'll take the key mix, plug the B input down the original, and we'll have the A input be this vector distort, and the mask we're going to plug in here for this. I'm going to put my viewer to it, and it should be fine at frame 100. It's just when we get further back in time, we are going to start to see the setup here. So you can see if I disable and re-enable, all of our clean work is maintained. So it's basically, we just basically cut this thing out right here, and it's warping the vectors. Now if you come back to your vector distort node, you have the option here for blur size. I usually put this up, if I see any kind of like jaggy edges in here, By increasing the blur size, it's basically blurring the input of your vector information, which helps kind of average things a little bit better. So now again, if I put my viewer from the original to the key mix, you can see there's been a big shift in the details, so I probably want to dial that down a little bit. Let's see here. Okay, there we go. So there's been quite a dramatic change in where things are at on here. And let's see if I take my blur node and increase this up a little bit. And again, you can come in here and do a quick grade on here and just add a certain red tinge to this. So you can kind of see, let's see here, actually let's go to, yes, there's our vector detail. And let me take green out of here. So we can kind of see where the information is basically being replaced. So you can see if I take this to the original and look at the secondary, you can see that it's done a heavy distortion warp job here on this. And if you come back to your smart vectors, your vector distort, you'll see that if I take the frame distance and bring that back, you'll get probably a little bit more return of what you had before, but you do get some weird results. So if I put this vector distance to 1 from 1, you can see that you're a little bit closer as we kind of start moving away from the reference frame 100, but you start to get weird results like this. So it's a balance of like increasing this frame distance here, and as you do that, it'll start cleaning this data up. So if I'm going to go all the way to 6 here, I guess I can do that right here. And this is where we're going to have some issues in regards to right here. I can't go too far down at too far of a distance on this type of stuff unless I affect my original mask here. So if I go back to my roto here, and because this is so low over here, what I want to do is change that up. So I'm going to go back to frame 100, and I can't get this data that basically gets hidden by the camera as we go back to frame 1. So this is one of the kind of the drawbacks to this technique. So I'm going to click on this little ripple edit tool here, move this up like that. And if I go back to frame 1, you'll see we no longer get that weird, or we shouldn't get, we'll give it a minute to render here. We'll see what happens. Yeah, so you can see we still get this blur effect. Now with my ripple edit tool still on, I'll take this and move it up. You can see I'm starting to get rid of that. So I can only clean up this area, unfortunately, as you can see. So I'm going to disable my grade node here and just look at the difference between the original and here. You can see it's done a pretty decent job. Again, this is something that wardrobe should have handled, not the post-production crew. You can do all types of techniques on here if you wish, but again, it is what it is. So you just want to kind of peruse through the shot and see if we're looking at any artifacts. So my settings here for this, and I'll get rid of this grade node for now. My settings is for this Rotopaint, for this vector distort node, is like a blur size of 8.8, frame distance 4. I can go even higher, but somewhere between 5 and 6 is probably fine. But you always want to go the furthest frame away from your reference frame and make sure there's no artifacts. So again, I'm looking and I'm not seeing any weird artifacts. So I'm getting a little bit of cleanup work that I can pull off, and that's good enough for what is going to detract the audience from not looking at our character and going, why is his shirt so wrinkled? So let me just go ahead and show you the setup here, in case you're curious, and let's just take a look at the options. So I'm just going to click each node, and you can hit pause to see what I did. Last thing we have to add, of course, is adding actual motion blur. Not motion blur, but actual regrain. So again, we're going to take a regrain node. I'm going to copy paste that in and pull that after the vector distort. It's got to read in the grain information, so I'm going to go back to the original footage here, which I could just use that, and let it sample that area. So we have to regrain that work, and we probably could add some motion blur to it by adding a motion blur node, because this still image is not motion blurred. So one of the other things we can add is just a motion blur node, and stick that right there. I'm going to put the shutter angle down to like 0.1 or something. I don't think we really need that much motion blur on this. So let me kind of space this out a little bit so you can see things a little bit clearer. There we go. So we have to have motion blur. The very last thing you add is grain, right? So we have grain on here. There's not a lot of motion blur going on. It's fluttering in the wind, so to speak. Let me go back to my Rotopaint node here. And I'm not a fan of this right here, so I'm going to sharpen that up a little bit. So again, I'll add a sharpen node. And I'll put my sharpen down to opacity of 0.1. And I'll make sure I'm set to all frames. I'm going to try to sharpen that up a little bit right there. There we go. All right, so let's go back to the key mix. And give it a second to register. So at this point, I'm going to cache this and see how it looks. Obviously, don't judge anything until you cache it. So I'll just come over here, full frame this, and let it cache. It's going to take a little time, but that's okay. So I'm going to go ahead and hit pause, and we'll be back. And there you go, and you can see that everything's holding up pretty well. And next thing what you want to keep an eye out for is any weird little warping down here on the edges, and it's only because this shot actually goes in and out of the character goes in and out of frame. We're basically moving in on his face or moving away from his face, and in doing so, you can get some weird artifacts. Had he just been a lockdown shot, fully in the shot for the entirety of the scene, we could actually have just cleaned up a whole lot more. But because of this, we only could clean up a little bit. So again, you can kind of pick a frame here and just compare it to the original. So I could put my viewer from this key mix here and put my viewer to this dot node, and I could do a little wipe if I want. So you can see I could do this wipe and just go back and forth between these two. So you can see the cleanup work that we did on this area, which is kind of cool. And you can hit this little bar to go like a crossfade. So little subtleties, this is really what the industry is about. Anybody will tell you that. So at this point, what I'm doing, now that I've committed to this, is I'll get out of this swipe here, and let's go ahead and move our milestone down here, and I'm going to disconnect that. I'm going to grab my background, hit D to re-enable, hit D to re-enable. So I'm going to rebake all of this all the way down the line. It's going to take some time, obviously, but this is basically where we're just about to start putting in our CG. So the cleanup work, I think I've shown you a good amount of cleanup operations in this program, which is really exciting. Hopefully this won't crash. It says not responding, so please don't crash. Whew. Well, that was close. Okay, so we got a million of these roto nodes here. Obviously, it's probably be a good idea to take this and make a backdrop. And I'll label this. And do I still have this color information here? This might be a cache information issue. I talked about this before. So this will be, yeah, we got some caching issue going on here. Wrinkle shirt, or arm, sorry. Whatever you want to label it, it's fine. So let me do cache clear all. See, I don't know why this color, I think we disabled this color information. I don't know why it's doing this, unless I left it in here somewhere. I don't think I did. I thought I'd erased it. So let's see here, just kind of change up the frame range here. That's odd. Oh, I know what happened. Because I enabled everything, I had this as a file that was not enabled, if you recall. So we got to come back up here, and where's that? There it is. The mask check grade. I'm just going to delete that. I think it's going to give us more headaches in the future here. So I used it to just check, so I just want to get rid of it right now. So this is going to be quite a cache, time to cache. So again, I'm going to take another coffee break, obviously, but we're just going to leave it to this finished lesson for lesson 7. As we enter into lesson 8, we're going to be getting into the awesome CG of the Blade Runner-esque TV monitors that we're going to populate later in the pipeline here. So just give us a second to cat. You can see like this is going to be a nightmare to sit through. But anyway, let's go ahead. Yeah, these things will drive you crazy, these roto nodes. So again, I'm just going to come over here to my right node and give this a second to breathe. And again, you cannot get away in production without putting a couple milestone renders in here. There is a pre-cache node. I'm not a big fan of it. You can cache it. It's up to you, honestly, but I like to just render out actual frames here. So I'll just hit render. Actually, let me save this. All right, and let's right away, shall we? One thing you'll note is the reality of so many roto nodes are extremely expensive when it comes to just the system here, and they can be quite a headache. I want you also to be aware of some errors that might occur due to your lack of cache for Rotopaint. So if this ever saves, I'm going to be able to show you what I mean. There we go. If you go to... gosh, my computer's like struggling. Edit preferences, and if you go to your cache, this is a very important area here. See this Rotopaint cache, comp disk cache? You can increase this to 20, I believe it's, gigabytes or whatever. So I don't think I'm going to need that much, but you can cache this if you wish to a bigger number and hit OK. And already you can see my computer is getting heavily bogged down by mostly Rotopaint nodes, believe it or not. You'd think that they wouldn't be too expensive. But there's also this vector information, all this fun stuff coming down the pipe here. So again, we're just going to take this and hit OK. And you can see the regrain is another thing that's taking forever to reprocess. So this will be a large cup of coffee, and we will return for lesson 8. So I'm going to hit render on here and hit 1 through 132, hit OK. And it's going to be a while, folks, so I will see you then.